The scent of varnished wood greeted me before the clerk even called the session. It reminded me of the mornings I'd spent here years ago, opening these same doors as an employee, not a defendant. My hand trembled around the handle of my old briefcase, its leather soft from decades of steady use. Not from fear, I told myself. But when I caught sight of my son, Mark, across the hallway, my chest tightened all the same. He stood tall, tailored, confident. The same boy who once begged me to carry him on my shoulders now barely glanced my way. Beside him, Lisa tapped her phone, rolling her eyes like the air itself had inconvenienced her. They looked so sure of their victory, and so distant that I wondered whether blood still meant anything at all. The echo of heels on the marble sounded like the clock of judgment, tick by patient tick. I tried to steady my breath, recalling the hundreds of hearings I'd attended as a township clerk, how many fearful faces I'd calmed with simple honesty. Now it was my turn to wear that expression. It's strange how laughter can wound more sharply than words. Mark's smirk cut me deeper than any cross-examination could. I tightened my grip, straightened my shoulders, and thought, I am not here to argue but to remind. I had watched hundreds of hearings in my life, but never expected to stand where the accused once did. Our house had never been large, but it stood straight and proud on its foundation, much like the life I tried to live inside it. After my wife passed, the walls seemed to echo more loudly, so I filled the rooms with the steady rhythm of routinely mornings, strong tea, and the same creak of the front steps I repaired every spring. Mark was only 8 then, lanky, and I used to spread documents across the kitchen table, the way other fathers might lay out toy trains. He'd watch in fascination as I traced my pen along deeds and permits, my precise handwriting becoming, in his eyes, some mysterious adult signature of importance. I told him that only the promise behind the ink mattered. Life passed according to ledger lines after that. I became the township clerk who could be trusted with both keys and secrets. My salary never made headlines, but my work did, in the quiet way honest work always does. People came to me for guidance on their titles, on boundary disputes, on the integrity of signatures. Principles fed me more faithfully than money ever did. With Mark's growing years came my growing hope that he'd inherit, not my job, perhaps, but my steadiness. He studied business, wore crisp shirts, spoke quicker than I did, and walked with the buoyancy of youth certain of its own wisdom. When he joined a construction company, pride swelled in me like air in a fresh kite. Then he met Lisa. Later, he simply family dinners transformed from conversation to commentary. Stocks, destinations, the taste of a rare wine. I smiled, contributing details only when asked, jotting in my mind a quiet note. Dignity doesn't require applause. There were nights when, after they left, I would wash the dishes slowly, listening to the radio hum through the small kitchen, feeling simultaneously proud and displaced. I told myself this distance was the natural tide of life, children rowing toward their own horizons. Still, sometimes I'd find his childhood drawings behind old folders, crude little stick figures signing their names in loops, and wonder when admiration had turned into avoidance. My days remained orderly. Ledger books balanced, neighbors waved, and morning walks carried the comfort of routine. I kept my late wife's photograph above the front desk, her eyes still bright with the faith she'd left me to uphold. Home to me was a promise: clean floors, trimmed hedges, and honest paperwork filed where it belonged. It was something I offered through precision and patience. So when Mark came by one breezy afternoon, all charm and casual air, asking me to help simplify the family paperwork, it felt natural to agree. I trusted more in blood than in ink that day as the pen glided across those printed lines. I never imagined that signature, the same one my son had once admired, would one day be the instrument of betrayal. For a time, I thought the matter settled. Papers filed, signatures neat, my part in that supposed simplification finished. Mark had thanked me with hurried words, promising we'd sort the small details later. He patted my shoulder as though I were a kindly old neighbor rather than his father. I filed the memory quietly beside countless harmless documents, never suspecting it carried the weight of my own undoing. Months slipped by in the calm current of small routines. Then one morning a thick envelope arrived, too formal to be friendly. Its language was polished, but its intent brutal: notice of eviction pending property redevelopment. For a moment, I stared at the dense paragraphs, convinced I'd misunderstood. My name was there, my address, and the signature that sealed. The notice belonged to a law firm I knew by reputation from Mark's new company. I read it twice, then a third time, until the words no longer seemed written in English but in some cruel dialect of ambition. The tea on my desk went cold as I read. Outside, the morning light looked the same, indifferent to human betrayal. When the clock in the hallway struck 10, its chime bounced through the empty house, an ironic applause for a man who prided himself on reading every clause, every term, every condition except the one that cost him his home. My late wife's clock ticked softly from the mantel, its rhythm forming an accusation I couldn't answer. I said nothing to Marky, and Lisa visited with cheerful smiles, chatting about their upcoming projects near the old quarter, never uttering the word eviction. I nodded, maintaining the fiction that everything was fine. After they drove away, exhaust fog fading down the street, I sat by the window for a long time, staring at the garden fence he'd once helped me paint. The fence had paled, but at least it still stood straight. Neighbors began hearing things before I breathed a word. Papers travel fast in small towns. Sympathy travels faster. Mrs. Patel from across the lane left muffins on the porch. The mailman hesitated longer than usual at my gate. "Bad business, Mr. Harris," he murmured one morning, shaking his head. I simply smiled and thanked him, clutching the rolled newspapers as though they were precious evidence. Perhaps they were. Every scrap mattered now. At night, I would pull open drawers, searching for old conveyance deeds, tax receipts, even the smallest notes. I arranged them in careful folders, as if the right sequence might undo what a single signature had done. The house filled with the scent of old paper, faintly metallic, comforting in its honesty. Whenever fatigue set in, I'd sip cool water and remind myself that silence is not surrender. They had no idea. I whispered to the clock one night that the clerk they fooled had read more property laws than they have pages in those glossy magazines. The words steadied me. They weren't an oath for revenge, only a reassurance that knowledge could still protect decency. One particular dawn, after endless nights of sorting, I found a file stamped 1979 restrictive covenant. Inside was the original trust deed I'd established jointly with my late wife. And there it was, one line, faintly typed, but binding nonetheless. Occupancy rights retained by grantor for a lifetime tenure unless surrendered by written declaration. No such declaration had ever been made. My signature transferring title couldn't erase that clause. I sat back, holding the paper close enough to see the fading ink. My pulse quickened, not with anger, but with fragile relief. The law, the same impartial force I'd served faithfully, and had left me one final measure of protection. In the days that followed, I visited the library discreetly, verifying every precedent, every statute that could uphold that clause. The young librarian brought me tea, thinking I studied for nostalgia. In truth, I was rehearsing quiet justice. I made no threat, no accusations, just notes. When the summons finally arrived with the court date, I ironed my shirts the same, one from our last family Christmas, and laid my briefcase by the door. It was time to show that some promises, like certain clauses, could not be erased so easily. The weeks that followed took on a strange rhythm, half lived in silence, half in slow rebirth. My mornings unfolded as they always had: tea, newspaper, a brief walk along the hedged lane. But afternoons belonged to the quiet hum of the public library. The librarian soon learned to leave me undisturbed in the corner near the window, where sunlight pooled in golden rectangles across the law section. There, among the statutes and dust, I read like a man tracing old paths to find his own footprints. I copied definitions, circled clauses, underlined exceptions, my handwriting steady despite age, marched confidently across notebook lines. Every evening I rechecked my notes, ensuring no loophole escaped me. Occasionally fatigue would press against my chest. I ignored it, tightening my tie before leaving home, as though neatness itself held the world in order. My shoes, though scuffed at the edges, bore a fresh polish. It became a ritual before each library visit, a small declaration that I would not meet dishonesty looking unkempt. At night, when I returned to my tidy house, the sound that welcomed me wasn't loneliness, but the comforting tick of my wife's old clock on the mantel. Time hadn't abandoned MIT, was marking witness. One afternoon, I sought out the notary who had certified the old family trust decades earlier. I expected another office ledger and crisp chatter. Instead, I found a retired gentleman seated on his porch, pruning roses with deliberate care. When he recognized my name, his brows lifted. "Ah, the Harris Trust," he said, a wistful note in his voice. I remembered the day vividly. Your wife had a clear sense of fairness. She insisted every clause be typed twice to avoid misprint errors. His eyes softened, recalling her insistence on completeness. I felt gratitude surge, warm and bright. The past, it seemed, had quietly preserved our integrity through him. He brought out his dusty archives, flipping through yellowed pages until my familiar signature appeared. Together we verified the documents, chain, everything authentic, everything intact. Before leaving, he clasped my shoulder and said, "You always did things the right way. That tends to matter in the long run." I walked home lighter, each footstep fueled by renewed purpose. Even with those papers in order, I knew I needed legal representation. Pride nearly kept me from asking, but humility, fear asking for help. At the county office, a young public defender greeted me amid a clutter of files. She couldn't have been older than Mark. Her eyes, curious and steady, studied my battered folders with respect, not pity. When I explained the situation, tracing timelines and referencing sections I'd memorized by number. She smiled faintly. "You've done half my job already, Mr. Harris," she said, astonished. "We'll make this right." The sincerity in her tone steadied me. Across that wooden desk, 2 generations met in shared regard, her confidence anchoring my resolve, my patience grounding her optimism. Each night I returned home to prepare further. The desk in my study, once used for township reports, now carried 3 objects: my notebook of legal references, the original trust files, and my gardening gloves. The gloves reminded me of labor's simpler lessons: cultivate, wait, harvest. Truth, like a hardy seed, survives in patient soil. Some evenings I'd sit there long after the lamp hummed warm, glancing between the papers and the soft leather gloves, finding a strange symmetry between soil and ink. "If only Mark knew," I murmured once, gazing at the parchment edges glimmering under lamplight. The document he mocked that night still had untouched paragraphs. The thought wasn't bitter, it was the quiet pulse of justice preparing to speak again. When the official letter confirming the hearing finally arrived, I folded it neatly and set it on the polished desk. The clock ticked behind me, faithful and unhurried. I dressed carefully that morning, aligning each button, tying the old silk tie my wife once favored. It wasn't vanity. It was respect for truth, for time, for every promise signed in good faith. As I stepped outside, a small smile crossed my face. I wasn't walking to reclaim wealth. I was walking to reclaim respect. The courtroom air had that particular chill unique to government buildings, half recycled, half unbending. Fluorescent lights hummed above, shining down on rows of anxious faces and a floor polished to a mirror's unease. I sat at the end of the wooden bench, my briefcase propped neatly at my feet, papers arranged as though neatness could anchor my nerves. Across the room, Mark leaned toward his lawyer, whispering with the careless confidence of someone who believes the verdict is already written in his favor. Lisa's perfume floated faintly through the air, artificial and oversweet. She looked at her nails, pretending all of this was routine. The clerk called a case. Papers rustled like dry leaves, signaling a storm disguised as bureaucracy. The judge, a composed woman with eyes trained by decades to read truth in pause and posture, invited the plaintiff's counsel to speak. Mark's lawyer rose swiftly, radiating certainty. "Your Honor," he began, "this is a straightforward matter of title transfer. My client, Mr. Mark Harris, lawfully owns the property in question. The defendant voluntarily conveyed title and is, under statute, occupying said property without right or compensation." His words landed sharp and professional, like chisels carving away history. He spoke of modernization, redevelopment, and opportunity as though integrity were an obstacle to progress. Mark nodded occasionally, attempting humility but betraying triumph in every twitch of his jaw. When the lawyer concluded, the room settled into that delicate hush before judgment. The judge turned toward me. "Mr. Harris, do you wish to respond?" I rose slowly, feeling each joint protest before steadying. My palms pressed against the bench, grounding the tremor that had begun in my chest. "Yes, Your Honor," I said, voice steadier than I feared. "I would like to clarify a few lines that seem to have been forgotten." The lawyer shifted, ready to object, but the judge motioned for silence. I opened my briefcase, unclipping the worn brass lock with a sound painfully loud to my ears. From within, I lifted a fold of papers older than anyone in the room except me. Their edges were yellowed but straight, the ink a testament to persistence. "This," I said, placing it gently on the table, "is the original trust deed signed by my late wife and me in 1979. It established occupancy rights for the grantor. That's myself for the duration of my natural life, unless vacated voluntarily in writing. No such declaration exists, Your Honor." Mark's lawyer leaned forward, eyes narrowing as though squinting might erase meaning. I continued, sliding another page forward. "And here is the notarized addendum signed by both parties to that these rights extend to the primary dwelling and its adjoining land. If you look closely," I said, turning toward Mark, "you'll see your initials faintly visible there, son, beside your mother's signature." A murmur rippled through the gallery, a fragile gasp, part disbelief, part awe. The judge leaned closer, examining the papers carefully. Her expression shifted, softening not with pity but with recognition, the clarity of truth emerging from patience. She lifted her gaze toward me again. "These documents are authentic." "They are," I replied. "The notary who certified them still has copies in his personal archive. He verified them just 3 weeks ago." The opposing lawyer stumbled over a protest, mumbling about updates and transfers, but the judge cut him short. "Contracts survive updates, counselor, especially when they include irrevocable occupancy clauses." You might have read the summary. Too hastily, color faded from Mark's face. For the first time, his confident posture faltered. The foot tapping nervously under the table betrayed rhythmless panic. Lisa's smile froze mid-curve and vanished entirely. I stood steady, not triumphant, but quietly vindicated by the echo of my own restraint. "I came here," I told the court, every word measured, not to shame my son, but to remind him of the promise his mother made him keep, the one she bound into these papers because she believed words last longer than pride. Silence followed, heavy, yet dignified. The memory of my wife seemed to fill the room, her moral clarity speaking louder than any of us. The judge exhaled softly before delivering her decision. "The eviction notice is invalid," she declared. "Title notwithstanding, Mr. Harris retains unconditional lifetime residence. Furthermore, the documentation presented demonstrates exemplary compliance and authenticity. The court commends your meticulous record-keeping, sir." Behind me chairs creaked. Someone whispered, "Admiration." I didn't need applause. I felt the weight of quiet acknowledgement settle like sunlight through dust. Mark bowed his head, unable to meet my eyes. Lisa stared straight ahead, fingers tightening around her handbag. The judge rose, adjourned the hearing, and left the room with the same firm stride she'd entered. I remained seated for a moment, letting the hum of fluorescent bulbs fade into something gentler. The adrenaline that had kept me upright drained away, replaced by an odd part sadness, part serenity. When the bailiff gestured softly toward the exit, I gathered my papers, the once threatened relics of my life's honesty. My finger brushed each page reverently, as though they were living proof that patience, not aggression, restores justice. As they walked out first, I gathered my papers, each page trembling like forgiving hands. Outside, the sunlight seemed almost foreign after the chill of the courtroom. The air smelled faintly of wet asphalt and relief. I walked slowly toward my car, conscious of my steady breath, of the papers tucked neatly beneath my arm, the same documents that had nearly cost me everything. Behind me came the quick shuffle of footsteps. "Dad," Mark called, his voice uncertain, stripped of the bravado it carried only hours ago. I turned. He stood a few paces away, hands in his pockets, shoulders curved inward. Lisa lingered near their sleek car, arms folded, her expression drained. "Of color, I didn't think. I just wanted to make something big," he said quietly. The words stumbled out like a confession from someone surprised by his own truth. I looked at him, this grown man who once built castles of sand in my yard and begged me not to let the tide take them. "You already had something big, son," I answered. For a moment, neither of us moved. I saw the realization flicker across his face, the sudden recognition that I could have said more, could have let the bitterness spill, but dignity, once defended, needs no parade. At home, the rooms greeted me with familiar quiet. I laid the documents in their tin box, the one my wife once kept recipes in. The papers made a soft sound as they settled. I closed the lid gently, as though closing the mouth of a weapon never drawn. My reflection in the window looked older, but lighter, framed by the wavering sunlight. Over the next few days, gestures came in small, hesitant offerings. One afternoon, a knock sounded at the door. Mark, wordless but intent. He carried a toolkit and walked straight to the gate, repairing the hinge that had grown for months. No apology spoken, but each turn of his wrench said what words couldn't, that he wished to fix something more than wood and metal. Lisa waved briefly from the car, her smile uncertain but without mockery. In the evenings I returned to my routines, watering the garden, straightening the porch. Chairs, listening to the steady click of my wife's clock. Satisfaction came not as triumph, but as silence, a deep kind of peace that needs no witnesses. I realized revenge burns quickly, but righteousness glows, slow and steady, in those willing to endure its patience. Months folded into each other until the sharp edges of that day dulled into memory, quieter but somehow fuller. On Sundays, the house smelled once again of roasted vegetables and coffee. Mark and Lisa began visiting without ceremony, carrying laughter that had learned its manners. It wasn't the loud, unthinking kind that once bruised the air, but a tender sound that came from humility, softening pride. Porch, sometimes talking about nothing at all, and the stubbornness we'd all inherited from love, not blood. From my seat, I often watched Mark at work in the community office, volunteering to update housing records. I saw a reflection of the boy he once was, the one curious about the integrity of signatures, a new respect, deliberate and kind. Lisa, meanwhile, had taken to gardening. She said the soil was good here, though we both knew it was the patience within it that made things grow. Most evenings find me on this porch with my journal open on my lap, lines filling slowly under the fading light. Property, after all, can be rebuilt. Trust must be earned plank by plank. Handshake. Time, I've learned, has its own courtroom. That knowledge feels heavier and kinder than any legal triumph. Inside, the clock on the mantel still ticks as it did in our childhood evenings. Its steady rhythm no longer sounds like a countdown. I rise, close the journal, and let the porch light fade into the first scatter of stars. Some inherit land, some inherit lessons. The wiser keep the lessons. Asterisk.